Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's the final point of the Riga conference. 3 days are almost finished, filled with a lot of discussions, with a lot of exchange of ideas, and also policy recommendations. I would like to remind you that the Riga conference started with a panel on women, peace and security, which is a resolution produced by the United Nations Security Council 20 years ago. And today we again are discussing issues related to the United Nations agenda. And this is not a surprise. Three presidents of the Baltic states and President of Finland are representatives of those countries which cherish international rule and order a lot. We can't imagine ourselves living in an anarchical world where the rules of jungle are dominating. We all are very much supporting different endeavors, international organizations and also individual countries, which could set the rules of international order which could serve the common good. And I found two quotes today which really reflects on what we are going to talk about. It's a plea of Robert Zoellick, who wrote several years ago that the new multilateralism will need to be a flexible network. It must maximize the strengths of interconnecting institutions, public and private. It should be oriented around pragmatic problem solving that fosters cooperation. A little bit later, Carlos Lopez wrote, there is the need for renewed multilateralism that would be based on integrated approach, as opposed to the traditional thematic clustering and isolated handling of the problems. Embrace the concept of global public goods. We are all here to search for common and global public goods. Without any further ado, I would like to give the floor to Estonian President Kersti Kaljulaid. And I would like to ask you, as now representative of one of Security Council members, what from your point of view is the rule-based international order and how this order is challenged and how Estonia is, as member of Security Council, is addressing those challenges. Thank you. The floor is yours.
Thank you. And since you mentioned the Zoellick's quote about the flexibility and networking, then I have to say that at least flexible and network the Security Council nowadays is, because there is simply no other option. And I'm really proud that after Estonian leadership in the Security Council in May, Estonian company Hybridity is retained as the UN partner for future hybrid meetings as well. But of course, as we all know, technology does not resolve any of our problems. Technology is there to facilitate communication, but problems we have to resolve ourselves. When Estonia was running for the seat in the Security Council, we were very much proactive on supporting reform, supporting also change for the Security Council. And I'm still of the opinion that the French call for avoiding vetoes wherever there is genocide under discussion, and also the discussion on the enlargement of the Security Council and its permanent members towards Africa, where we have most of our conflicts, is a valuable discussion. And maybe Africa could be represented not by a state, but by the African Union, which is the most rules-based body on the African continent. On else, what we have tried to, as well, it was one of our campaign promises, was to enlarge the scope of the Security Council more into the digital discussions. We were really worried that in 6 consecutive working groups, UN had been discussing how cyber should be treated in the international law and also in the UN. We thought that maybe it's easier just to grab an opportunity should one of those arise during our stay in Security Council. And we were only 2 months in when in early March, Georgia reported of a cyber attack, and supported by UK and US, Estonia took it up under any other business in the Security Council, creating a first you don't believe it, but indeed it was the first discussion about cyber attack in the Security Council. We believe that this is a valuable example. We also followed up in March on the on this issue in the area discussion, where we dealt also with cybersecurity, conflict prevention, and capacity building. Estonia has also been vigilant and bringing the questions about Belarus, for example, into the United Nations Security Council. And as I already mentioned, Georgia, that cyber attack which was directed against Georgia. Estonia does not limit and has never limited its activities in United Nations only to the Security Council bid and now to the Security Council work. Women, peace and security was mentioned, and I've been for 2 years the vice president of the high-level working group, Every Woman, Every Child, precisely in order to facilitate the discussions how we can help women, children and adolescents in the conflict. I have been very much supported in this work, by the way, by former Finnish President Tarja Halonen. So thank you also to Ms. Halonen there. Similarly, Estonia has been looking for ways where we specifically could contribute. We have a memorandum of understanding with African Union in order to develop digital tools over there. And also we have a long-standing working relation with UNDP in order to facilitate the e-governance development in less developed nations. And you know, we right now got very practical about it because Estonia signed another MOU with International Telecom Union. And this is now already for creation of a Lego-like toolbox of e-government modules for countries who want to have it as a freeware. So you see, we are trying to work in the UN context, not only in the Security Council, but in Security Council, we remain true to the Lennart Meri's saying that international law and the rules-based world order is the nuclear weapon of a small nation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Indeed, the last saying is really very impressive, and you demonstrated with your speech that the United Nations, it's not only Security Council, that within this organization, and even sometimes we are complaining that this organization is too complicated and there are too many bodies and too many sub-institutions, but it's also an opportunity for countries which would like to achieve their goals, and you are really successful in this field. And now I would like to turn floor to President of the Republic of Lithuania, to Gitanas Nauseda. And if we are looking around, then we are evidencing a lot of violence in different parts of the world. Violent conflicts today is a part of world's reality. From your point of view, is the UN effective and efficient in preventing, mitigating, minimizing the spread of violence? And is the United Nations fit for coping with hard security issues? Thank you. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Professor Ozoliņa, for addressing this question to me. Ladies and gentlemen, first of all, let me begin by thanking Egils and all the organizers of this conference for the hard work they have done. It is a pleasure to see you, Egils, as well as Kersti and you, Sauli, in this panel. The Riga conference has a good name of a forum for geopolitical discussions. A dialogue is what really matters, and sincere conversation has the power to bring peace and heal old wounds. And yes, we are indeed living in dangerous times. There are many armed conflicts burning all over the world. The dark reality is that Europe is no exception anymore, and we must deal with this fact. This makes the UN Charter, signed 75 years ago, even more relevant today. Seeking answer to the most pressing issues of our days, we inevitably turn back to the time-tested principles, such as fundamental human rights, sovereign equality of all states, and the supremacy of international law. We, the Baltic states, you will agree, know very well the price of widespread violations of the international order and international law. We will always look for the United Nations to act resolutely and decisively on the breaches of international norms. To be effective, multilateralism has to be supported by compliance with the existing agreements. If any member of the international community fails to comply with the rules, there must be a response. And if real danger to the international peace and security arises, the UN Charter sanctions are a tool to prevent escalation. I believe that we must learn from the hard lessons of European history and fight back and reject the outdated worldview of spheres of interests and secret agreements. Remembering the victims of the totalitarian regimes of the past, we must work resolutely for the peace and security of the future. Let me take an example. We have all seen the recent agreement between Russia, Azerbaijan, and Armenia on Nagorno-Karabakh issue. It may indeed stop the fighting and for now improve the humanitarian situation. However, this agreement does not consider the interests of both conflicting sides, and it does not involve the OSCE, Minsk Group, or other international organizations. Neither does it provide for international peacekeeping forces that would be free from the immediate interests of the neighboring power. All these factors do not leave much hope for a sustainable, peaceful solution. The only bright spot in that, the trilateral agreement, foresees the participation of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, who will need adequate resources to work on refugee return and peaceful coexistence. One more example, Belarus. The United Nations, as well as other international organizations, have an essential role in assisting the civil society of Belarus to establish the dialogue with the authorities. This is the best way to discuss the transformation of the country, strengthen its independence, and protect human rights. In order to prevent further gross violations of human rights and destabilizing foreign interference in Belarus, we should insist on discussing the situation in multilateral fora. Lithuania has repeatedly voiced concern over this issue at the United Nations, the OSCE, and the Council of Europe. As a result, the so-called Moscow mechanism was invoked to investigate the violations of human rights in Belarus. Our Baltic neighbor, Estonia, has raised the Belarus issue at the Security Council. Thank you, Kersti, and I believe they must continue seizing all the available opportunities in this field. Finally, I would like to draw your attention to the fact that Russia, one of the permanent members of the Security Council, is right now bluntly violating international law. After the Russian invasion into Georgia, 1/5 of the Georgian territory remains occupied by Russian forces. The human rights and the security situation in the Georgian regions of Abkhazia and South Ossetia is worsening. Ukraine's Crimea region also remains occupied and illegally annexed by Russia for the 6th year. Just a situation is unjustifiable. The international community must continue supporting the independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity of Georgia and Ukraine, as well as Moldova, within their internationally recognized borders. That means not recognizing the illegal annexation of Crimea, as well as ongoing occupation of Abkhazia and South Ossetia. Special status for Transnistria should also be respected. My sincere belief is that the United Nations and other international organizations will be effective in dealing with security challenges. The first step is not to turn a blind eye on the violations of international law. We all should remember that supporting the victims and rejecting the aggressors is in everyone's interest. I hope I answered your question. Thank you.
Thank you very much, President Nauseda. And indeed, again, there is no another more efficient instrument on international level as multilateral organizations which could really follow basic principles and to ensure that human rights are very high on the agenda, even if, as you mentioned yourself, enforcement issues are still lagging behind and there are a lot of efforts needed from different member states of the United Nations. And now I would like to turn the floor to President of Finland, Sauli Niinistö. You are definitely more experienced UN members than the three Baltic states because we joined much later. And you have your experience with multilateralism. And as you know, and we all noticed it, that in recent years, multilateralism has been challenged and questioned by several global and regional powers. And there are countries which prefer either unilateral or bilateral approach in dealing with risks such as pandemic, climate change, and regional conflicts. Does it mean that multilateralism is outdated and losing its potential? And what is the Nordic perspective on the future role of the UN and multilateralism at large? Please, President, floor is yours.
Good evening. Thank you very much. I'm sure that you have done very good job there for the last, 3 days the conference has taken now. Yes, it has really become kind of fashionable to say that multilateral cooperation is broken. It is not completely broken. It is challenged, but still operates. But of course, multilateral cooperation needs to be reinforced, reformed, and updated to fit for the future. Is the glass half full or half empty? We have to be ambitious in making the UN better, but we also need to acknowledge its achievements. The World Food Programme receiving a Nobel Peace Prize is a good example of successful multilateralism. The program has made a difference that has been felt by millions. Common challenges, common solutions. It should be obvious that enemies like pandemics and climate change can only be fought together. But can they unite us? It sounds like an empty slogan, but it is true. We need international cooperation more than ever. Great powers can at least think that they can succeed without international cooperation. Our countries, the Nordic and Baltic countries, do not have that luxury. It is like Kersti quoted, multilateralism is a nuclear weapon of small states. Effective multilateralism really is essential to our national interests. we have good reason to support and defend the system. But in supporting them, are we realistic enough? We all heard in September UN General Assembly that both China and Russia emphasized a lot multilateral cooperation. So the question is multilateralism in 2020 what it used to be, or what we think it is, or what we hope it is? Whose rules, standards, and norms in the order now based on? To what extent are European values and interests reflected in the international system? France and Germany have been pushing for an alliance of multilateralism. Will it be somehow fitting or matching with the Biden administration's ideas of an alliance of democracies? Like-minded groups are needed, but that is not sufficient. How do we convince other countries, those who are neither committed multilateralists nor democracies, to cooperate with us? The return of the US to organized international cooperation can be an encouraging example, but is it enough? We need to talk particularly with those with whom we agree the least. On the pragmatic Nordic perspective, the famous quote from the former UN Secretary General Dag Hammarskjöld remains valid. The UN wasn't created to take mankind into paradise, but rather to save humanity from hell. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Indeed, on the global level, we need different kind of policy options, and to have a global forum for dialogue is also very important. But on the other hand, there is always pressure. Where are deliverables? What about efficiency? And how to contain those countries which do not comply with international rules and international order. So indeed, there are very difficult questions still on the table. And now I would like to turn the floor to President of the Republic of Latvia, Egils Levits. And I would like to continue on the same note of multilateralism. And if I look backwards, at least 20, 25 years in a row, there have been constant demand to reform the United Nations, to reform Security Council, to reform decision-making process, to make the United Nations more and more efficient. What do you think? Are those demands justified? How are those demands to be translated into decisions? And should the plea for more effective multilateralism and global governance be sustained? What would be your take on that?
First of all, I would thank Sauli, Kersti, and Gitanas for the participating in this conference. Indeed, we are representing 4 from 193 member states of the United Nations, and we are co-responsible for United Nations and for the global world. As 1945 United Nations were created, there was a lot of hope and a lot of idealism. And this is reflected by the United Nations Charter. Of course, the world reality is different, but we need this idealism in order to see what is the right direction. I said already, United Nations, there are 193 member states. Some of them are democratic, some not. Some of them are humanitarian, some not. So we are very different states, and all these states to bring together This is already an achievement, so that we can have a common basis from these absolutely different states for the world's order. And this order is based on multilateralism. Of course, there are certain states which would prefer in different times already nowadays, but also earlier, unilateralism or bilateralism. But of course, if we are thinking on effectiveness, then I can say that in long term, only multilateralism can achieve the results which we all wanted, which we all want. And I see this is also valid not only for small states, but also for bigger states, for regional powers. Because nowadays there is no more one power which is dominating the world. There are at least several. And the interests are different. And therefore, it is return to a unilateral world or bilateral world, like during the Cold War, is not more possible. And the only possibility to achieve the goals, to solve the global issues like climate change, like technology threats to the states, to democracy, to the human freedom, or like disease, like today, the pandemic. I think we need multilateralism and the United Nations as an organization where all states of the world are there. It's a discussion forum. Of course, United Nations are criticized for ineffectiveness. But as Sauli said already, we can ask whether the glass is half full or half empty. We should look also to the achievements of the United Nations in the last 75 years. And we can see that the United Nations had created a solid basis of international law, of international conventions, and also soft law, a lot of soft law. And this is already now the basis of our thinking and is creating standards. And if there are global standards for international behavior, then we can say and measure whether one state or another state is acting in respect of the standards or not, but the standards are there already. This is a very, very important achievement. And I would say that in the reality, there are also other achievements like peacekeeping missions as United Nations Development Program, as already mentioned here, and others. Of course, by all differences of 193 states, very different states, I would say that the achievements are really considerable. Of course, we can look now how to improve the effectiveness. And for this, on political level, I would say there should be a raising of awareness how to solve the problems and, in the same time, how to reform the United Nations. It's very slow, but it happens. For example, now we are discussing on UN level the technology issues. 10 or 15 years ago, it was a non-issue on global level. Today, we are already discussing, and maybe we can speak further on that. We are ready, or we would propose also to have a global regulations on that. But we can compare with the situation maybe by the beginning of United Nations 1945. At the time, it was a normality, a standard. Then maybe 1/3 or a half of the world's territorium were colonies. It was normal. Now it is not normal, and maybe 10, 15 years later, 1960s, the public opinion of the world has changed already. And I think because the problems are so important, it would also have some repercussions to the perception of the United Nations and to give more weight to the reform efforts. And I am quite sure that in the next decade, or this decade, the 20s, there would be already a considerable reform. And our 4 countries, we are always for such reform, but I think there is already a big support in the world for bringing the reform on the way. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. By the way, if we look at the Riga conference agenda, there were 3 panel discussions on technological issues, and 2 of them very clearly emphasized the potential role of the United Nations to introduce global regulations of cyberspace. Probably sometimes we are approaching the UN purely from peace and security perspective, but forgetting that there is a lot of potential hidden and probably not fully utilized. And most probably this current agenda is pressing the UN also to respond and to engage indeed. So thank you very much. Dear Presidents, questions are coming in, and it's my responsibility now to address those questions directly to you. So I would like to start with a question which is asked to Madam Kaljulaid. And the question is, to some extent, also a reflection to those discussions which we had here in Riga for 3 days. And the question goes like that. There is an agreement that Russia is still the only existing threat to NATO. Is there consensus on the danger from China? What would be your take on that?
Indeed, my thinking is that Russia, with its shrinking demography and also not so good economic success, is more and more the Europeans' regional adversary with whom we Europeans need to deal ourselves to a certain extent, because globally there might be other worries. There is indeed China, which is a growing economic power, which also has become more assertive in international arena, and we do not know its intentions because it is not a democracy. We cannot really estimate and plan, our relations into the future. Therefore, I believe that for NATO, indeed, there are many areas where it needs to be quite vigilant. Of course, the problem here is that if you have new risks coming up, it doesn't kind of remove your old risks. And therefore, I'm quite happy actually that the European nations have been gradually coming around to the idea of reinforcing their own military capacities to deal with the risks relating to Russia ourselves, to be able to deter ourselves. And this is nothing doing with President Trump and his thinking on 2% and his insistence on 2%. It's just that the European countries have realized that globally, as a value-based democratic league, what NATO really is, transatlantic organization, globally, we have different problems in various areas. And indeed, big attention of NATO and its biggest ally, US, will be directed also in understanding what China is doing. For NATO as well, I believe, because we are talking also very much about technology here, it is extremely important that we realize that in the authoritarian regimes where government controls quite a lot of tech development and has also easy access to data, therefore can make its artificial intelligence to learn from the data which they have, this might lead to the situation where we, the free and democratic nations, where AI is mostly developed in private sector, not anymore under the control of government, might miss out if we do not specifically reach out to the private sector to understand better what are our options of working on AI, and also in setting in place rules for our artificial intelligence to be as smart as the totalitarian AI, which means we must allow our AI to learn that it does not remain, well, less developed than the Chinese AI. And this is urgent both from the societal needs, also from the defense and military needs. This is obvious and becoming more and more obvious. So I do expect NATO to direct big part of the rising resources, which it will have hopefully when countries come closer to 2%, to understanding better the technology, working with the private sector in order to be sure that we incorporate this thinking into our work as well.
Thank you very much. Indeed, difficult questions again. By the way, quite interesting question just came in a couple of minutes ago, and this question is addressed to all presidents, and the question stands as follows. How long does the United Nations remain a glass half full in light of increasing violence and breaches of rules? When do we say we need pragmatic change? So half full depends on level of optimism and pessimism, but still this question again reminds about actions needed to enforce efficiency of the United Nations and really to find ways how to approach those countries which breach those international rules, how to manage that glass finally is not half full, but a little bit more than half full. So probably, President Niinistö, you were using this glass term. You could expand on it.
Yes, thank you. First of all, we have to recognize that the geopolitical situation has changed very rapidly, actually, during the past decade. And you can't actually build up UN. You can't fill up the glass without recognizing this competition of the great powers. Now it's China and USA. This is not so nice to say, but nevertheless, a lot depends how these big ones are handling and how do they get along with each other. We heard Kersti telling about Security Council. That is surely the table where one can see this kind of competition actually going on all the time. So this is first element, whether the geopolitical situation will somehow be organized. Now it is still quite open. When Kersti was talking about China, we have to keep in mind that they have enormous monetary resources. Sometimes I counted, it's years ago, that with their dollar reserve, they could buy every single share in Helsinki, Stockholm, Copenhagen, Oslo, and Amsterdam exchange or in bourses. That is a huge way of using power. We heard that Russia is keeping on by military power, and USA may be having both fiscal and military power. So, how to build up further? It is kind of interesting what Germany and France have been talking about, alliance of multilateralism, and Biden and his administration about alliance of democracies. it might be also dangerous, because can we just form groups where we have an easy way of going forward, because there are no such members who would behave in a different way? That is also dangerous. So it must be very closely thought. This is not only just due to UN, like I already described, the relations between the big powers. Actually, what is in my mind, we were yesterday having a kind of a similar panel with colleagues from Germany and France, and they were eager to discuss about CSCE, now 50 years old, or 2025, 50 years old conference. And surely OSCE, like its institutional continuity. Should we try to do something similar worldwide? I know that the reputation of the conference was not very good at its time, not specifically in Baltic countries and some other, those countries under Soviet command. But nevertheless, situation has now changed, and even the situation with the great powers has changed. It's not Russia and US anymore. So we should try to use every possible means to find at least a decent way of handling arguments and differences.
Thank you, President Niinistö. President Levits, what would be your comment and your response to this question?
I agree with Sauli, but I would like to add one comment. Maybe we can also activate the role of the European Union. The European Union, no member state is big power alone. But together, 27 member states, European Union is a big power and contributing much to United Nations finances, and also politically has a weight. And I would say that it's much more easier to have a common views on the reform of the United Nations or on the global issues as such within the European Union, and then united to go further in the United Nations in order to promote reforms, but also without that, parallelly to solve the global problems. For example, the climate change is a European political issue, and the European Union is a champion in promoting climate issue, which is a global issue, of course. And I would say also this European dimension should be brought into discussion by the effectivization of the United Nations, and maybe we should have a common line within the United Nations in order to promote the reform.
Yeah, thank you. Indeed, the EU has already its global strategy, and there are a lot of priorities and also a lot of intentions included which could fit into agenda of the United Nations, but some kind of speed up activities are needed to foster EU's engagement in UN affairs. And here I see one question which would go to President Nauseda, and the question is as follows: what is the role of bilateral cooperation between states in a world where we are more dependent on collective efforts like the EU and NATO? So is the role of bilateral relations still relevant, or we are more moving into the world of multilateral relations? President Nauseda, what would be your response?
Thank you very much. But if you allow me, I will answer the previous question and then I will switch to this question a little bit later. So I would like to remind that UN Charter allows sanctions against those countries and those states which breach international law. But of course, we have the right to complain that reactions, the problem is not the absence of reactions. The problem is that reactions come too late and they are too little, too small. And in this case, maybe sometimes we have to ask ourselves that we put too high expectations on concrete international organizations. In this regard, we are talking about United Nations. But if some crisis occur, and let me remind you the crisis in Belarus, the international organizations and automatic mechanisms of decision-taking cannot replace the role of leadership. The leadership of individual countries, individual politicians, and then can fill this gap, which is extremely important. If the reactions from international organizations come too late, I see the problem in two regards. First of all, the people in suffering countries are disappointed because there are violations of human rights, but nobody is taking care about it. And the second, the image of international organizations just suffers too because of inability to take the decisions fast and effectively. So this leads me to the conclusion that we have to use all the instruments we have on the stage in order to solve the international crisis in many countries where those crises occur. Now, I would like to answer this next question. Yeah, I don't think that multilateralism replaces the role of bilateral relations, and probably the Baltic countries, Poland, Ukraine, Eastern Partnership countries are a very good example of this. We have very close relations with our neighbors, with Latvia, Estonia. We improved our relations with our neighbor, Poland, in the recent time, and we improved it very sufficiently. So I think that we have a lot to discuss between us, and only afterwards we can put those questions on the agenda of European Union or other international organizations. So I think there is not competition between bilateralism or multilateralism. This is just complementary to each other.
Thank you very much. Here is one question which was sent in by Mr. Maher Nasser, who is the director of the Outreach Division in the United Nations Department of Global Communications. And he would like to ask a question. The question is pretty long, so sorry for reading it, but I will summarize and then hopefully you'll remember the whole text. So the question goes like that. Today's security challenges include those emanating from new technologies that did not exist when the United Nations was created in 1945. In his remarks to the United Nations General Assembly on 22nd January this year, Secretary General Antonio Guterres identified the dark side of innovation as one of the four looming threats that endanger 21st century progress and imperil 21st century possibilities, and outlined a series of recommendations to dealing with these. The Secretary General has argued that the world needs more global digital cooperation to avoid digital fragmentation, common effort to ensure that artificial intelligence is a force for good, the need for new protocols and norms that define red lines and build agile and flexible regulatory frameworks, including some legally binding measures. The Secretary General announced his intention to present a roadmap for digital cooperation covering internet connectivity, human rights, trust, and security in the age of digital interdependence. What more does this distinguished panel think is needed, especially in areas where member states hold the final say, as is the case with the developing legally binding instruments? So, to wrap it all up, the question is that there is also danger, this dark side of innovation, that there is not only integration but also fragmentation. And therefore the question is, so what we have to do more, what has to be proposed in order again to develop legally binding instruments. Everybody requests legally binding instruments. I would like to start with President Levits, so please.
Yeah, thank you. I would remind on one very important notion, standard setting power. Every standard reflects certain interests. And of course, it is in the global interest to have common rules on internet or on digital technologies as such, in order to promote, so to say, the good side of internet or the technologies, and to prohibit or to hinder the risks and the dangers. And for this, we need rules. And I think in the last years, more and more there is a common sense throughout the world, not only in Europe, but throughout the world, that we need rules. We can have soft law rules, which are much more easier to achieve that, and we need, but also legally binding rules. We should promote both. We should think about which rules and on what kind of regulations we need. Then we can, of course, discuss further that, but I think there is a common sense. And I think European Union is the best placed now to put forward these issues within the Union and also globally. On the level of the United Nations, because we are already, so to say, very progressive in data protection. The European regulation data protection is a real achievement, and other states like United States are in practice, in reality, adapting our European rules. And I think it's a task, it's a political task for the European Union to go forward with such rules, proposal of rules. Of course, it takes time. It takes several years, maybe a decade. But we have already, we can see, we can speak about the achievements of United Nations, but there is already a lot of international standards in environmental protection, which were adopted by United Nations, and more or less they are respected. And I think the next step is now to promote legally binding rules and soft law rules on the use of technology, so that we can promote that what is needed, what is advantage for the humanity, for the people, and to hinder that risks which are linked inevitably with artificial intelligence and with digital technologies. I think it's a good task for politicians, for the people in Europe, and especially in our region, because we are very developed in digital technologies, and we should promote this work not only on technical level, but also on political level.
Thank you. Now I would like to ask the same question to President Kaljulaid, because you started also your introductory remarks with digital issues. So how to ensure that those legally binding instruments are at place? Please.
Well, there is indeed something which absolutely every country can do. You can declare your understanding on how international and even national law applies in cyberspace, and how you see also in the cases of crisis, how you would apply your intentions. Ambiguity is a nice thing, but sometimes clarity is also an element worth having. And I would suggest reading Tallinn Manual, the product of the NATO's Center on Cybersecurity, to inform yourself how you could start thinking about it. But the main idea of Tallinn Manual and numerous other academic works on the issue is that you don't need a special set of rules. You just need to explain how you apply our international law in this new cyberspace. Because in principle, when governments go more digital, their sovereignty can be attacked by the internet means, via cyber attacks. And hence there is no difference in analog space and digital space. Taking this approach, which I value very much, is also in this sense worth having, that we cannot regulate for each generation of technology, because tech cycle nowadays is much shorter than legal cycle. So simply taking up the notion that our analog legal space also applies in cyber actually helps and facilitates a lot on our thinking, and probably would be something well recognized already, based on which then the United Nations Security Council can continue its work when Latvia is the member of the Security Council, which is going to be happening in 26, 27, I am sure of that. So by this time, I believe that many countries have declared their intentions, and also we have much more clarity. Thank you.
Thank you. And now I would like to address the same question to President Niinistö, please.
Yes, I fully agree with the previous speakers. It has always been the case that when innovation in whatever area goes forward, also the dark side of it goes forward. And unfortunately, it often seems that if we take a, well, let's say it, protective side is a bit late. And I'm sure that artificial intelligence and the development of digital technology in the future creates also similar situations. Yes, we have to think to whom it is dangerous. Partly this dark side, partly it's a common danger, partly it might be a weapon for somebody to cause danger to others. And this brings me to actually to nuclear weapons, which were created after Second World War. Undoubtedly, the situation now is not good, but even during the Cold War time, those big powers saw that this is too dangerous for both of them. So they started arms control discussions. I think that also in this aspect, the dark side of innovation, we are very nearby to a situation where we have to look very close what the big ones are doing, whether they could understand that this is a huge danger for everybody, and starting not only setting rules, which is a good way, surely, but we should also, in a way, make everybody see that there's a balance of danger here, putting it on balance. Something like this.
Thank you. And now, President Nauseda, what would be your proposal, how to introduce those legally binding instruments against those who are on the dark side of innovation?
Thank you. Very good question indeed. We cannot ignore that new technologies are preoccupying our daily life in geometric progression. as it was identified, they can bring not only the possibilities, but also the threats. The question of ethics or the modalities of how we are using them, in my eyes, is essential. Fully agree with the UN Secretary General. We must ensure that artificial intelligence, new technologies will be used for the good of our societies. It must be based on the same principles on which our democratic societies are based: freedom, human rights, the rule of law, and openness. There are issues which remain to be resolved. For example, who is responsible for the use of artificial intelligence? This and other solutions must be found in an inclusive, open, and transparent way, involving policymakers, practitioners, and other professionals, as well as civil society. We see positive international efforts, and I would like to name one of them: an initiative on principles of artificial intelligence ethics is being discussed in the UNESCO. We all know that modern technologies, regrettably, may also be used for committing crimes. It is clear that we should pay more and more attention to the cybersecurity, management of cyber incidents, implementation of cybersecurity requirements and standards. Nevertheless, innovations is a main tool for the transformation of our societies and our economies. Otherwise, we will be left behind by our competitors. So we must deal with them, as we deal with so many challenges of 21st century. Thank you.
Thank you. Here is one question which is addressed to President Niinistö, and the question stands like that. Finland and the Baltics have a lot in common. And indeed, it used to be that Finland was a Baltic state. And how can these similarities be leveraged to build societal resilience together? And indeed, societal resilience is probably not the question number one on the UN agenda, but it is definitely one of very relevant issues in our part of the world. So how Finland and the Baltic states could work together in order to increase societal resilience?
Yes, thank you. There are a lot of similarities in our nations, and that means that ordinary people, tend to think in a similar way. So that's why in social life, I think that that gives a good basement to trying to cooperate and building up also resilience. I think that the history tells that people have had, and they must have had, a lot of resilience in each of our countries. I take up one element which is, I think, building up quite a lot of resilience in Finland. That is the obligatory army service. It's not, I have done it, most of the boys have done it, and now it's open to girls too. And it's not just learning military lessons. It's suddenly you find yourself sleeping in the same room with 20 other youngsters coming all over from the country, having a very, very different background. And after you face some hard tests during your service together, that builds up a kind of feeling together. And that kind of, if you get it as a youngster, you don't very easily forget it. So together, we are more resilient than just one by one. But back to Baltic countries and Finland, due to similarities in history and due to similarities also, I guess, in ordinary people's thinking and ways of life, I think that we could very well help each other finding models and ways of growing resilience, which undoubtedly might fit very well all the other ones too. So I think something like this is possible in between us.
Thank you very much. I wanted to ask all of you one question which you could really answer in a very telegraphic way. And during the first or the second day of the discussions, we had a panel on the future of NATO. And the reference year was, of course, 1949, when NATO was established. And all panelists agreed that 70 years of NATO's existence, they were very difficult, but they were very promising, and security in transatlantic space was ensured. And there are no doubts that the next 70 years will be as successful as historical 70 years. Today we are talking about the United Nations 75th anniversary, and we agreed more or less that those 70 years, with all difficulties, with all controversies, still the UN contributed to peace and stability in a way how the UN was formed and what was UN's organizational structure. It served the purpose, if not fully, that at least there were definitely less conflicts, less contradictions and controversies around the globe. What would be your take on the next 75 years of the UN? Could we start, please, with President Kaljulaid?
Well, with all multilateral organizations, you must always keep in mind what might be the alternative. And normally you come to the conclusion that because it's unique, it's the one and only UN we have. So by definition, of course, we do everything to keep it alive, keep it developing. And frankly speaking, I've been thinking about all this complaining, how difficult the world is and how slow the process is and so on, which is all, of course, true. But nevertheless, I would like to stress that the world has actually never been a calm, peaceful place. I believe that actually, through all the work UN has been doing, today, the world, despite all the problems we have, despite all the horrible things happening around the globe, first of all, we are aware what is going on, much more aware than we were previously. And indeed, we keep trying to resolve the problems. It's the only option we have, and we keep pushing. At least I promise Estonia will. Thank you. Thank you. President Nauseda, what would be your prognosis?
Probably I would like not to give any prognosis, but just to wish that this organization remains effective. And I think the only one way to remain effective is to be able to adjust itself to the changing environment. And I think no matter what happens in this world, it's always better to talk and to look for the solutions than to fight. Thank you.
Thank you. President Niinistö, what would be your stand on this?
Actually, Gitanas just ended his speech, thinking that I can very well accept, and I'm seeing it in a similar way. Actually, I said that we need to talk particularly with those with whom we agree the least. Such countries are, well, this is a kind of paradox. They are very, very central also in how UN will work in the future. Those who are not, would I say, very nearby in their attitudes or in their behavior, not very nearby to us with the European tradition. So all the efforts of keeping them on board and trying to make them understand the importance of international standards, international laws. That is very crucial if we look forward how UN will develop in next decades.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
There's not any secret key to be used. I don't see such possibility that suddenly it would be okay.
Thank you. President Levits, do you have a secret key?
No, I don't have a secret key, but I can see, and I am very, very sure, that in the next 70 years, the role of the United Nations will only increase. Because the people want to solve problems, and we have more and more global problems. And United Nations is, as Kersti said, the unique organization which represents all global world. And for this reason, there would be a push to the United Nations to solve problems, and that means also to increase the effectivity. So I see a good future for the United Nations.
Thank you very much, President Levits. So on your optimistic note, we could conclude our discussion, and I would like to say thank you to presidents of Baltic states and Finland, and indeed your thoughts on the future of United Nations. It was critical, but at the same time very promising. And as all you said, it's up to us, it's up to member states, it's up to nations. How do they see the United Nations and how they contribute to the United Nations agenda? Thank you very much. And at this point, I would like to take an opportunity when I'm still having a microphone on, and before giving floor to our Minister of Foreign Affairs, Edgars Rinkēvičs, I would like to thank all people who were involved in organization of this conference and implementation of all those ideas which were planned for quite a long time before the conference first day. And when the conference is over, very often journalists and also civil society representatives, they ask why such conferences are needed. And one of our partners, data collecting company Norstat, did a survey for us, which actually proved that majority of Latvian population, they are aware of NATO contribution to Latvia's security and stability. People know exactly what the EU is doing during pandemic times, and they are quite aware what to do if they will be caught in the middle of the crisis. So dialogue which is taking place within the margins and within the center of the conference contributes to better understanding of where do Latvia stand in the global world. And particularly, I would like to thank our traditional supporters, partners and participants, which is the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Ministry of Defense, President's Office, such partners as Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, embassies of the United States, Norway, Canada, Microsoft, European Commission representation in Latvia, the Boston Global Forum, and many, many more participants who particularly took seriously situation with pandemic, and they supported digital conference and digital solutions for our dialogue. And particularly I would like to thank Lato team, very many people starting from Sigita, Justīne, Kristaps, Heinrichs and many others who were very directly involved in organizing the event, and also so-called the Riga Conference friends who worked almost a year debating the content and also practicalities. And we also produced a new product of the Riga Conference, which are those policy briefs, and we will produce those policy briefs along the whole year. And the Riga Conference 2020 will gradually grow into Riga Conference 2021, when we will be able to embrace, to hug and kiss each other in face. So thank you very much for everybody who was contributing. And now I would like to give floor to Edgars Rinkēvičs, Minister of Foreign Affairs, who is one of politicians who actually is with us starting from 2006.
Dear Presidents, dear viewers, actually I just got a good statistics that throughout the whole day and a half, 143,728,000 unique viewers were watching this event. And I want to say that I'm truly happy to be in the first Digital Riga conference, even if it is happening in a very unique circumstances. We are all fighting COVID pandemic. We are all trying to cope with many challenges. But I think this has been quite an experience for all of us, those who have been organizing this conference. We still hoped a couple of weeks ago that this is going to be hybrid, with some people being here. Now we have mostly digital event, and we are very happy to say that actually we feel that this has been quite success. Well, normally I would say that this event would conclude by some reception, by some networking. This time we are going to have some reflections, but I think that as the digital event, this has been a very thought-provoking, and the quality of both sound and also the discussion has been extremely good. I think that we missed each other very much. I very much hope that next year we are going to meet in person. Normally, it is very difficult to make conclusions after so many words of crisp wisdom. I think that as journalist Michael Year wrote in his Twitter account yesterday that he would make 3 major points of this conference. That everyone agrees that unity is important, that NATO is the most powerful alliance and force for good and democracy, and there is no mentioning of Turkey. I think that he was wrong on the 3rd point, but everyone can agree on the first 2 points. Turkey was mentioned actually by many participating in this discussion. I think it's also very difficult to add something new on this discussion, but let me just outline a couple of points that I normally do. First, we all understand actually that the structural change is happening both in the European Union and in the United States. This is not very much dependent on that or another politician who takes that or another office. This is more related to the internal change of our societies, on the way how the world challenges are being seen, and also how the ideas are exchanged and implemented on how they should be tackled. But I think that we all understand that there is a need to reinforce and reinvest in the concept of what we consider as the modern West, that we still believe that we share common values and common interest. And I think this is what we need to do in coming months and years. Second, we all understand that China and Russia is going to be actually one of those challenges we are going to spend time, and we are going to discuss more equally how to deal with both. Third, it's also too early to say where Europe is heading. Actually, it was always too early to say where Europe is heading in the last 30 or 50 or even 70 years. But at least now we know that we need to deal still with some nuances like Brexit. We still need to fight COVID. We still need to find a way how to address some of the economic challenges. But I think also that we understand that to some extent Europe is now much more stronger than 4 years ago. 4 years ago we were debating Brexit and everyone got emotional. Throughout 4 years period, actually those emotions have vanished, and we are dealing with this in the most rational way one can imagine. First, I think that we still understand that both southern and eastern neighborhoods of Europe are very important for future of Europe. And we are coming to the greater understanding of what our southern members of EU think about situation in their close proximity, and also they start to understand much better our worries here in the east of Europe. But also, I think that we all understand that there is still going to be a very challenging time and also pressing issues in both neighborhoods. In the south, we do have a situation that we need to address from Libya and Syria to Middle East peace process. Here in the east, we have seen actually that in our very close neighborhood in Belarus, some of the very basic human rights are being violated as we speak. Yesterday, the very sad news came about the death of the young Belarusian man in Minsk who was detained by the plainclothes police, Roman Bondarenko. And I think that this is another call to the global and European society that we cannot stay apart, and we cannot only issue statements of concern or grave concern. Today, we agreed with my Lithuanian and Estonian colleagues to reimpose the third round of sanctions, naming those who are actually working in the Belarusian security apparatus, and we will also urge our European colleagues to expand sanctions. I think it's also time to start to exploring the need for economic sanctions, but I think that Europe cannot actually stay idle in this, and we need to have more action. We also hosted here today the leader of Belarusian opposition, Madam Tikhanovskaya. We all had her passionate speech here in the Riga conference. We had meetings, and we reaffirmed our full support to the struggle of the Belarusian people for freedom and democracy, human rights, and rule of law. Finally, let me say that there is also always some historic context I love to invoke. 6 years ago, we were discussing a very challenging situation in Europe with Russia's aggression against Ukraine, occupation and annexation of Crimea, and somehow we were looking back into the history. In 2014, we were invoking many lessons of 1914. That was centenary of the beginning of the First World War. There was much of uncertainty. Now we are invoking another chapter in the history. 100 years ago, the world was battling the Spanish flu. Now we are battling, and I'm absolutely sure that we will succeed, COVID-19. We are still hoping for vaccine, for cure, but I think that we all understand that we will prevail. That actually that will be one of the challenges that most probably is going to change the way how we think or how we address some of challenges and some of those issues that are laying ahead of us. But most importantly, we also must fight the disinformation disease. We still need to fight very much for democracy, for rule of law, and for human rights. And despite all of some of skepticism, I still believe that we are going to prevail like we did it 100 years ago, 70 years ago, or just 30 years ago, when the Baltic states were actually declaring, as we speak in 1999, their restoration of independence. So there are always ups and downs in the history. There are always plenty of food for thought for us. But for now, I'm very happy to close this conference by saying, test negative, stay positive, and see you in Riga in person next year for Riga Conference 2021. Good night.